The best investment advice, and this was from my dad, was to buy property. It's very simple. The mistake that I did make was I should have started buying earlier.
Welcome to the Get Invested podcast, where we share great conversations with experts from all walks of life to uncover their secret know-how and where they invest their time, their skills and their money, and the benefits that this has created. You see, the truth is that everyone invests. Every minute of every day, we're investing our time, our skills, our energy and our money in something. Some of us are investing consciously, some unconsciously, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, and sometimes for no impact. Get Invested will help you to start living by design, not by default. I'm going to help you to make it happen, not let it happen. You'll hear the top tips on how you can live with conscious intent so that you can live more, work less, and leave a living legacy by investing now. Listen to the show to discover the top tips on how to get started, make the most of your investment journey, and ultimately to be living your dream, not someone else's. More episodes can be found on iTunes or at bushymartin.com.au/get invested. Thanks for listening, and now let's get invested.
Welcome, freedom fighters. Are you interested in investing, but you just don't know enough and you just don't know where to start? Well, you may be glad to hear that after studying successful investment for more than 35 years, I've discovered that success is formula-driven. You just need to learn what it is and then apply it. Now, mastery of anything starts by acquiring knowledge which builds skills, which gives you comfort and clarity, that leads to growing confidence, and this gives you the courage to take action based on calculated risks. There's a lot of C's in there. Now, this is where today's guest comes in. Peter Koulizos is affectionately known as the Property Professor, and with good reason. Based on decades of his own property investment experience, Peter has spent his last 20 years combining his talent for teaching with his passion for property to deliver hands-on, actionable and real-world education in property investment across TAFE, University SA and Adelaide University here in good old South Australia. But he delivers this to students right across the nation. Now, this complements his own graduate diploma in property, his master's degree in business specialising in property, and a master's of urban and regional planning. He's also an accomplished author of 2 books, The Top Australian Suburbs, and he's co-author of Shares versus Property. And I also quote his gems of wisdom in my own book, The Freedom Formula. Now, in addition to educating property investors to be successful, he's also committed to their protection in his role as chairman of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, or PIPA, of which I'm a proud member. As PIPA advocates a code of ethical conduct for industry players as a way to eliminate the sharks and the shysters that have given property such a bad name in the past. Now, in this highly informative and very wide-ranging discussion, you'll learn about the question of property and or shares, the merits of building versus buying, houses versus units and apartments, what is PIPA, what is PICA, how do they help you and how can you help them, the most common mistakes that investors make, the keys to successful property investment, where the current top Australian suburbs are to invest in, and what are the current challenges in property and what can you do about them. As you can see, this is an absolutely action-packed episode that you'll want to listen to a few times. So please enjoy Peter Koulizos. Welcome back, freedom fighters. It's Bushy Martin, and on Get Invested today, we're talking to the person who's affectionately referred to as the Property Professor. He's someone that I've been following and respecting for a long time. In many ways, we've enjoyed parallel property paths, and he's what I call the ultimate outvestor because he learns it, he does it himself, and he teaches others. So please welcome Peter Koulizos. How are you, Peter?
Thank you very much, Bushy. That's a lovely introduction.
Mate, very honoured to have you on board. As I say, been following you for many years with all of the work that you've done in relation to educating property investors around the country. But for those of the listeners who don't know who you are and what you do, can you just sort of give us a quick rundown, please, mate?
Yeah, so firstly, I run the property investment course at TAFE. Well, there are 3 courses: the fundamentals of property investment, renovating for investment, and property development workshop. I also lecture at the University of South Australia in the Bachelor of Business Property program, specialising in property development, property valuation, property economics. And from time to time, I also get a gig at the University of Adelaide, teaching in the Masters of Property program, specialising in property development. So I do a lot of teaching across a couple of unis and the TAFE. So that's my full-time job.
Awesome, mate. Now, probably a more interesting question is why the teaching? You've obviously got a real passion for teaching property. Why is that, mate?
Well, I'll take a step back. Before I was a lecturer in property, I was actually a school teacher.
Right.
And I worked out I wanted to be a school teacher when I was in grade 5 because my teacher was so fantastic. I thought I want to be like him. And to this day, I don't regret it. I love teaching, but what's been really beneficial for me is just under 20 years ago, I was able to combine my 2 passions, which were teaching and property, and so that I can teach property on a full-time basis. I was doing it on a part-time basis initially through a group called WEA, which I think in Victoria they call it Adult Community Education, and I'm sure every state has a different name for it, but there are places you can go to either learn how to make coffee, learn to bookkeeping, to background if you're going to travel somewhere. Not accredited courses, but very good information taught by very experienced people. So that's where I started the teaching property stuff. Actually, even before that, I was teaching my primary school students about investing.
Awesome.
About property and shares. And here's something you don't know, Bushy. In one of the schools that I was at, we actually did a renovation project with the primary school kids.
Fantastic, mate. That's awesome.
I probably wouldn't try it these days because the bloody paperwork involved would be horrendous.
Yeah.
But there was one of the students in the class, her grandma was selling a unit, and we arranged so that we, as in me and the kids and their parents,
yep,
we would go and fix up the unit, and whatever it sold for above and beyond what we thought it was worth unrenovated,
yep,
then we would take that cut.
Brilliant.
So a few weekends we went there and we didn't replace the carpet. Some carpet people came in and did that.
Yep.
Painted. We actually painted. We did up the garden. It was only a unit, so there wasn't that much to do.
Yep.
And it all sounds wonderful, but unfortunately this was done around the time the GST was introduced.
Right.
And the market was very soft. So in the end it sold for what it would have sold for if it was unrenovated anyway.
Okay.
So we didn't make any profit, but there was a lot of great learning that happened. And even to this day, when I bump into some of those kids that I used to teach, and some of them I bumped into uni have gone on to do business degrees.
Yeah.
They still remember that as a highlight of their school career because it was real life learning. It wasn't just talking the talk. It was walking the walk.
Yeah, that's
so
brilliant.
And that's one of the great things about the TAFE courses that I teach. It's real life. Like there are no test assignments or exams.
Yeah.
It's all about trying to make money in the real world of property, which is different to university, which is a lot of it's based on theory, and there are test assignments and exams.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the original question was, sorry if I'm taking too long to answer.
No, that's good. That's a great answer.
If your original question was why did I teach property, well, I started at a very young age with my primary school kids.
Yeah, that's brilliant, mate. And engaging kids at that young age, I'm sure, as you've mentioned, that would have been very impressional upon them at an early age. And
it was, and the parents, even when I bump into the parents from time to time, they still remember not just the fixing up of the property, but how you have school fairs.
Yep.
There's school, or in my class, if you wanted to run a store, you had to show me a business plan.
I love it.
So you want to do a sausage stall? No worries. How much are the sausages going to cost? How much is the gas going to cost? What about your tomato sauce? What about your onions? What are you going to sell the sausages for? If we can see a projected profit, you're on. If not, well, we have to go back and look at something else.
Love it. Mate, that is awesome, teaching real-life skills that are always questioned in that sort of normal mainstream teaching exercise. There just isn't enough real-world financial
I think,
input.
and I know we're not talking property here, but I think teaching kids how to save money and spend it wisely is just so crucial.
Yeah.
It's a skill that parents used to teach in the old days. I don't think it's taught that much anymore by parents, but if the parents aren't doing it, then we need to put it back on the schools and primary schools rather than high schools, because bad habits have already been learnt in the young ages, so we need to get them early.
Yeah.
I think it is so critical if we can do that at a very early age.
Totally agree, and it's an awesome segue into your own upbringing, Peter, because clearly inculcated early in your experience was a focus on money management and property. Can you tell us a little bit about that, just to shed the start of your journey and how that influenced you moving forward?
Yeah, well, look, my dad was a real estate agent.
Yeah.
And so I grew up in a real estate family. And so I think just through a process of osmosis, I soaked up all of this property knowledge without really knowing anything about it. And it wasn't until I got older that I really appreciated the proper management of money, because as you probably guessed from my surname, I'm Greek. So Mum and Dad came over from Greece, but they came over 50 years ago with no English, no money.
Yeah.
So, I mean, learning the language is one thing, but being able to manage the money once you got it was also very important. When you've lived with very little money, and in the case of Mum and Dad, they also lived during World War II, when, you don't go down to the shop to buy stuff off the shelf, because number one, there is no shop, and if there was, there's nothing on the shelf anyway.
That's right.
So you had to be self-sufficient, and whatever money you got, you had to manage it wisely. But and I think I also developed a good work ethic from my dad, because a bit like I have now, I've got a number of different jobs. Dad also had a number of jobs. He had jobs during the day, and he had jobs in the evening. And then after a while, so basically, Dad came over when he was 25 and started working in factories. And then after a few years, he went to night school to become a real estate agent. And he was a real estate agent at the age of 35.
Okay.
And he retired when he was 45.
Brilliant. He's obviously hit the golden patch there as far as
That's right.
growth goes.
And there are golden patches throughout our property history. And if you're fortunate enough to be active during one of those golden patches, you can certainly make a lot of money.
Yeah, I've always said if you're in it long enough, you're going to hit a golden patch, mate. So
very true.
Yeah, that's awesome, mate. So a great starting point from there. Let's sort of flick it to your own investment journey then, given that property was obviously in the blood at that stage. What was your first property investment, mate, and how did that go?
Yeah, so as I said, I was a school teacher, and one of my first jobs was out in the country, a little country town called Ardrossan on the York Peninsula of South Australia.
Yeah.
And interestingly, a bit like now, because to rent a place was about the same as the mortgage on a place, and when we went to Ardrossan and I knew I had a permanent job, we were originally going to rent, but we couldn't find anything to rent, so we bought.
Okay.
So we bought our first home.
Yeah.
So we virtually bought our first home because there was nothing available to rent.
How much? Can I ask how much was it? This will be interesting, I reckon, because we're similar ages. So what did you pay?
It was $31,500, and we paid an extra $1,000 for all the furniture in the house. These people were heading off on their caravan around Australia.
Love it.
And we're similar ages, aren't we, Bushy? So we remember there was no 5 or 10% deposit back then, mate.
No, exactly right, mate. No,
it was 20-25% deposit.
Yeah, well done. No, that's an awesome effort. So secured your first
So
home.
we lived there I lived there for several years, and then
Yep.
we came back to Adelaide,
Yep.
and an opportunity came up to buy a group of units in Ardrossan,
Okay.
because I did have an emotional attachment to Ardrossan,
Yeah.
because we were there for so long, and daughter number one was born there. But more importantly, from a property perspective, as I discovered, it is very hard to find rental property in country towns. And I figured, geez, if I've got, 3 units here, I'm almost guaranteed that I'm going to find tenants.
Yeah.
So that was our first investment property. And what was really important about that is we had very good local knowledge.
Yes.
Because we've heard of the term location, and that is very important in property. And local information, in particular information about the micro and the macro location, are so important when buying property, because the one thing you can't change about a property is its location.
Absolutely.
You can change many other things. You can renovate. You can even demolish it, but you cannot change where it is. So that was our very first investment property. And then I didn't have the patience that my father did, who just bought and held property. I thought, well, what else can I do?
Yeah.
And we were back in Adelaide, so we'd shifted from Ardrossan and back in Adelaide.
Yeah.
And my wife comes from a good Catholic family of 3 girls and 3 boys, and so my 3 brothers-in-law wanted to do something in property.
Okay.
And we found a place in the Adelaide suburb of Parkholme,
Nice.
where we could keep the house and put 2 at the back. Now, this was our first venture, so none of us had the knowledge nor the money to be able to build 2, but we did sell off the place with the plans to do 2.
Yeah.
And I wasn't in a position to put in a deposit to do this, so I said to my brothers-in-law, I said to one brother-in-law, can you lend me the deposit to buy into this? So he lent me the deposit. So just simple sums. And for the young people listening to this, you may not believe it, but the house cost $80,000 to buy.
Yep.
We each put in $6,000 as deposit.
Yep.
So we did whatever we had to do so far as the houses was concerned.
Yep.
And all of us got our $6,000 back, plus another $6,000 on top. So that was 100% return on equity.
Yep.
It was probably about a 30% return on investment.
Nice.
Because all up it cost us about $90,000 when you consider the renovation and the buying and the selling costs.
Yep.
So that was my first venture into long-term buy and hold. And interestingly, Bushy, the family still owns those 3 units in Ardrossan, almost 30 years on.
Is that right? Are they still getting pretty good yields, mate? There's pretty strong rental demand there?
Yeah, look, what we have found in the country is it takes longer to rent than if you're in the city, but the people tend to stay longer as well.
Yeah, okay.
It's not like if you're in Adelaide, well, you can easily move from one suburb to the other because it's like, a few hundred metres or a K away. Yeah. But in the country, it's not that easy. Yeah. So we've been very happy with them. Yeah. And we certainly plan to hold them for the long term, the very long term.
That's awesome, mate. So the one that you did with your brothers-in-law, that's sort of starting to get a little bit more active in the exercise in terms of carving it up and selling off the land. Where did that lead to, mate? Where did you go from there?
Then that was the first and last time I did anything with somebody else. Not because it was a bad experience. Yeah. But I was in a position now to do it myself. Yeah. And thankfully, my brothers-in-law were all silent partners because that was the deal. Right. I said, you can all put your money in, but you have to come. You have to come and do some of the work. Yep. But I'll let you know what we need to do and when we need to do it. So that was fine. Yeah. Then we went and bought a place in the Adelaide suburb of Carolta Park. Okay. Similar thing. We were able to keep the house and chop off 2 blocks. Yeah. And interestingly, we sold one of the blocks off to my sister-in-law. Okay. Who built a house there, and she still lives there. Yeah. And Carolta Park was not the popular suburb back then than it is now.
Yeah, right.
Now it is very popular.
Yeah.
And then we went off and did a little subdivision in the Adelaide suburb of Seacliff, Hallett Cove, McLaren Vale, Halloran Hill.
Yeah.
I love the southwest part of Adelaide.
So do I. Yeah.
The southwest quadrant. One of the reasons is you have so far as supply is concerned, you've got the physical barrier of the sea, and they're not building any more houses over the sea, but you've also got the psychological barrier of the hills. There's a lot of people in Adelaide, going over the hill seems like a big thing.
Yeah.
Even though it might be only 1 or 2 k's to go into a different suburb, but going up O'Halloran Hill or up to Belair, it's like you're in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I love about Adelaide. It's a little bit different from some of the eastern states' capitals in that where there's a big focus around distance from the CBD because of the nature of Adelaide and the plains, the hills, and the beach. The beach tends to take a much bigger play in potential demand, and therefore I think it allows us to elongate where the opportunities are. And you've mentioned the south. I'm very active in the south myself, and have seen that do so well because it is the areas that people want to live. So, that's awesome, mate. And if we sort of, at some stage, you moved into the more active property development front in manufacturing growth, and then holding them or selling them, mate. What was the plan of attack?
So when I can, I just try and subdivide and sell the land.
Yeah.
Because the value in real estate is in the land.
Yeah.
So trying to build and compete with builders who can obviously build for a lot less than I can.
Yeah.
Is just too hard. So generally in the past, I have built to keep. So I did a development in Seacliff Park where we held, so that was a group of 6, and we held, actually did a joint venture with a relative of mine.
Yeah.
I kept 4, he kept 2. We kept them for 5 years because the best depreciation is in the first 5 years.
Yep.
Then we sold those. Then I went to Port Noarlunga.
Yep.
And
good spot.
Bought 2 houses on a corner, was able to retain both houses but utilise the adjoining vacant land to build another 2 houses.
Yep.
So that's what I did, and I still have those.
Right.
I built those and kept them.
Yep.
Then I went to, I went to Christie's Beach, and I built 3 there.
Yeah.
And originally I was going to keep them, but I then found a lovely site on the Esplanade at Port Noarlunga South where I'm currently building 3.
Yeah.
And I've decided, well, I wanted to keep all 3, but my builder wants to buy one, so he's going to buy one.
Okay.
I'm going to keep the other 2.
Yeah.
So in the meantime, I've been selling off those places at Christie's Beach because I figure my capital growth's going to be a lot better on the Esplanade than it is going to be 1 kilometre from the Esplanade.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, look, awesome. Now, there's a real progression there, and what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, mate, is that predominantly it's now a build and hold strategy. You may sell down some of the land components to reduce debt exposure, I'm guessing, and to take those funds, as you say, because of the benefits of doing that versus going through the cost of building, and often if you're only doing one into 2s, it's difficult to make that stack up. But yeah.
Oh, very difficult to make, mate.
Yeah.
1 into 2. You have to go, because every man and his dog wants to do 1 into 2.
Yeah.
But it's when you get into 1 into 3 or more that you're not competing with the typical mum and dad developer who don't do their numbers properly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, look, my strategy is if I'm looking to make some quick money, forget about the build, just sell off the land.
Yeah.
But the best way to make money in property is to hold. It's not the only way to make money, but it is the best way to make money. So I'm at the stage of my life now where I'm looking for income to help with our retirement.
Yeah.
So being able to hold on to these properties is a good strategy for us. Plus we'll also have, if we're talking about the Esplanade, we'll have properties on the Esplanade which should have very good capital growth.
Awesome. Now, something I'd also like to dig into a little bit, because it's, again, we share a common belief in this, and it's probably a little bit different to a lot of people that I hear, see and read in the industry, and that is that we both embrace the benefits of building. You because of your experience, me because I started life as an architect and a project manager, so I have no fear of controlling the building process. But I hear a lot of other people in the industry who appear to be quite negative around the perceived risks of building. What are your thoughts around that, Peter?
Well, the one thing I don't like about the new housing industry is that, unfortunately, if there's going to be a rogue, they're going to be there, because there is a lot of money that can be made on commissions or project management.
Right.
So maybe it's got a bad name from there.
Yeah.
But for me, one of the great things I like about building and holding is my costs are at a wholesale level. So let's just say, the thing cost me $500,000 in land and build.
Yeah.
Well, in class, I teach my students to work on a 20% gross profit.
Yep.
So the whole thing is worth $600,000.
Yep.
So from day one, you've already got $100,000 worth of equity.
Yep.
Your mortgage is based on a $500,000 cost, but the tenant's paying you based on the thing being worth $600,000.
Yes.
So, it's not uncommon from day one to be neutrally or positively geared in a new property.
Yeah.
Now, the downside is, because it is new and probably doesn't have a lot of land, then there may not be as much capital growth, but that's why location is so important, because in my opinion, location is the biggest driver of capital growth. Next comes land. So providing you're holding those new properties in very good locations, then not only will your cash flow be good, you'll also minimise your tax because there's great depreciation benefits.
Yeah.
One of the reasons your cash flow will be good is because you don't have a huge amount of repairs and maintenance to do, because it's brand new.
Exactly right. Yeah, it's interesting because I guess one of the myself and my wife and those that we help, given the numbers we run, we're big supporters of build and hold. And if you're going to hold, it's the affordability of the property that becomes important, because, as you'd know better than I, over 50% of first-time investors sell their property within the first 5 years. And I'm sure it's because they don't focus enough on the affordability. Now, everything else has got to be right. The location's got to be right. The property's got to be right. But if using the new build exercise to reduce improve your cash flow affordability because of the benefits that come from the depreciation and other, then you're more likely to be able to last the distance and enjoy the capital growth that would flow from a long-term hold exercise. Is that what you've found? Yeah.
Get the location right. You do need some land. I'm not a big fan of apartments. And we have to, in South Australia or Adelaide, what we term apartments is different to what they might term them, or what they might refer to in the eastern states. But for us, apartments are small dwellings in relatively modern high-rise buildings, and flats and units are something different.
Yeah, right.
They're places that were built many years ago, generally single-storey, double-storey, probably at most, and in a small group of maybe up to 10 or 20. But apartments, you might have 100 or 200 in the one group.
Yeah, I'm very concerned about what's happening in the CBD in that regard with a lot of Chinese investment. There's going to be a real glut of those apartments happening, and every time I see people start to offer incentives like rental guarantees and stamp duty concessions, all the rest of it, there's a problem.
That's right. If they have to offer those sorts of incentives, that's right.
Now, one of the terms that I love that you use, mate, and I'll just because I've picked it up in the reading, that sort of revolves around the scarcity approach, which you've used before, is it's all about location, land, and looks. I think that sums it up perfect. I actually quoted that in my book, Peter.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, because I think that just sums up the generic approach very well. Do you want to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, not only have I been involved in property almost all of my life because Dad was a real estate agent, and I teach it, but I have studied it for many years. I have 3 postgraduate qualifications that are related to property or town planning.
Yeah.
So when I was writing my first book, I really had to think hard about, what really is it that drives capital growth.
Yeah.
And we've heard location. I thought, all right, so location is one of them, but what else is there? So when I studied it properly and also anecdotally, it was obvious to me that land is a key component to capital growth. And this year is actually the 10th anniversary since I wrote my first book, which was called Top Australian Suburbs. And so what I've done now is gone back to see how good or bad those forecasts were. And there was a few very important lessons that were reinforced. And one of them is that houses do better than units. Yeah. For example, in my top 20 suburbs in Melbourne, 20 out of the 20 suburbs that I picked in Melbourne, houses did better than units. In Sydney, 18 out of the 20 houses did better than units.
Yeah.
In Adelaide, 18 out of the 20 suburbs I picked, houses did better than units.
Oh.
So, and what you've got here is, in property there are generally 2 components. It's the land and the building.
Yeah.
And it's the land component that appreciates in value and the building component that depreciates in value. So the more of whatever you spend can go into the land, the better off you're going to be so far as capital growth is concerned. So if I can just give a simple example.
Yep.
So if you've got $500,000 to spend, you can buy yourself a really run-down old house in an inner western suburb of Adelaide or Melbourne or Sydney. Not that I think you'll find one in Melbourne or Sydney for 500. Let's just use Adelaide for now.
Yeah.
So you could pay 500 for an old house on a good-sized block in the inner western suburbs, or for 500 you could go buy a brand new 2-bedroom apartment in an inner western suburb.
Yeah.
So I've picked inner western suburbs because in regards to location, the most important thing is proximity to the city.
Yes.
Because the main reason is that's where the highest concentration of jobs are.
Yeah.
But if you can't be close to the city, the next best thing is close to the sea.
Yeah.
Because Australians and many other people around the world highly regard their lifestyle, and when it comes to lifestyle, the beach is number one. So if we look at these 2 properties, the reason I picked that house in the inner western suburbs because my daughter and I have just gone 50-50 in a character house in Brooklyn Park, which is an inner western suburb.
Yep.
Which we paid $490 for.
Awesome.
So we could have either paid $490 for that house in Brooklyn Park, which is 4 k's from town, or we could have gone to Bowden, which is a lovely development, and bought an apartment for the same money. But in 10 years' time, we would be lucky to sell that apartment for more than what we paid for it because there are more and more apartments being built in that area.
Yeah.
Whereas in Brooklyn Park, there are hardly any bungalows, and actually the land that it sits on is worth more than the house that is there as well, because I can see people are knocking down houses and building 1 or 2 new houses because the land component is so valuable. Exactly. So why is it so valuable? Because it's close to the city. So what I'm saying here is you don't necessarily go for a big block of land, because if I use an Adelaide example again, a 200 square metre block of land in Maylands is going to be worth more than a 2,000 square metre block of land in Manapara.
Yes. Yes.
All right, so it's not the size of the land, it's the value of the land.
Yeah, the scarcity
and
factor.
The other term you mentioned there, Bushy, was looks, and by looks I mean character, or in the eastern states they call it period style.
Yeah.
Or it has a nice outlook, a nice view. And the best view you can get is a view of the sea. The second best view you can get is a view of the CBD.
Yeah.
And then after that, it's open spaces. So if it's Adelaide, it's overlooking the Adelaide Hills, or a large open space like a reserve or a park or a footy oval. So they are the three key elements. Get your location right. Find a location close to the city or close to the sea. Land, in other words, buy a house rather than a unit. And looks. Ideally, try and buy a character home. Now, it may not be a house, like it's a detached house. It might be a duplex or a maisonette. Excuse me, Bushy. But I think if you can't afford to do that, rather than buy something that may not perform as well, just wait, save a bigger deposit so you can buy something like that. Because the problem with buying property, it costs a lot of money. Buying and selling property, transaction costs are very high.
Yeah.
So it's not something you want to be doing on a regular basis. So either if you can't afford to buy in the right location, buy a house, and the older the better, then save for a deposit, or you might like to go, like I did with my daughter, go 50-50. But the problem, or do it, buy it with somebody else. It may not be 50-50, maybe a different proportion.
Yep.
But be careful. If you're buying with somebody else, then you bring in a different risk, which is called business risk.
Yeah.
So the property might be fantastic, and your mate that you bought with, you know, he's great when you go out fishing or going out for a weekend or of a night time. But, you know, maybe ask yourself, when was the last time you saw his wallet to pay for a coffee or a drink or a meal?
Absolutely.
All right? It's one thing to have brothers and sisters and friends, but it's a very different thing to be investing in property, for this example. So just be wary of that. I mean, it can be a good move, especially if it's within family, but just be careful of that.
I think you've picked up a very good point. I've always said, like you, I'm very reticent, particularly in the property front, to be doing anything other than by myself unless I absolutely have to do otherwise. And my first property development was with others. But I think the focus needs to be on how are you going to get out, not how you're going to get in. And if you've got
good. What's your exit strategy?
Yeah, if you're clear on exactly how that operates, and if there is, it's the what ifs. It's look at the worst case scenario, the likely scenario, and the best case scenario. And if you plan for the worst and then expect the best, you've probably got a chance. But if you're going in and then looking at, okay, if someone needs to get out early, how are we going to do that? How's it going to affect it? And do that before you've even bought the property, then you've got a chance at least covering off on those issues that are invariably with the dynamics of who we are and what we are. But I often say to people, if you're going to go in to invest with someone or go into business with someone, would you marry them? Because that's about how well you've got to get along if you're going to do it long term. What's your thoughts around that, mate?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we're talking big money here, so you want to make sure that you make the right decision, because if it's an ugly separation, just like in marriage, you can lose a lot of money. You need to be very careful.
Yeah. Now, mate, you made a couple of other really good points, I think, with that discussion around location, land and looks. And one of the things that I think, just to reinforce some of those key aspects, I often say to people when they're looking to invest, because they tend to go for what appears to be a cheap property, but it's always about scarcity and then demand. And I often say to people, what do you live in? Do you live in a house? Yes. 3 or 4 bed? Yes. Well, that's going to be the sweet spot, because like you, every other Australian likes to live in a house. So a real house in a real suburb with growth opportunities versus what might appear to be a cheap unit where only singles, divorcees, students and others can get in, and therefore cap its growth. Because the other thing that I think becomes important in terms of sustaining the growth long term is to follow the jobs, as you've picked up. So look at the number of professionals in an area, look at the incomes and the growth in incomes in that area? Because if people can't afford to keep paying more for the property, then that's obviously going to stilt the growth at some stage. Is that sort of part of the approach that you take?
Yeah, look, it's interesting, Bushy, because I had a very similar discussion with a couple of my friends last week, and I asked them, and they were all property investors. So I said, out of all the properties you've bought and owned, which one do you think you've made most money on?
Yeah.
And without an exception, all of us said the houses that we've lived in. Because the houses that we live in, we're very particular about the location we pick.
Yeah.
Because there are many reasons we pick that location, whether it's close to family or close to schools or whatever it might be.
Yep.
But investment is a different story. So I think also if you can pick your right first home, that helps in a number of ways. Firstly, if it grows in value faster than other properties, you have a great chance to upgrade to a bigger and or better home.
Yep.
And also with that increased equity, it allows you to buy an investment property.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. Now, that's awesome, mate. Now, in all of the teaching work that you've done, and because what I love about teaching is that you're forced to really look at what you really believe, and it helps you to sort of take a structured approach to then be able to communicate that easily and effectively so that others can then take advantage of that. How's that helped you? And with the students that you've helped over the years, what are the mistakes that you've seen some of them make? And as a result of that, what do you think are the keys to successful property investment from the experience you've had today?
Look, some of the more severe mistakes I've seen people make is get into property development before they're ready. So some people want to go from zero to property developer.
Yeah.
Whereas they should go from nothing to buying one or more investment properties. Yeah. And then when they are familiar with property, then by all means take the next step, because property development is riskier. Yes, you can aim for a 20% gross profit, which is great, but an increased return also comes with an increased risk.
Yeah.
So you need to be careful there. The other one is people that have bought apartments, and this is before they come into my class, because one of the first things I say in my very first lesson is, if you don't remember anything else from this course, please remember this. You are never, ever going to buy a brand new apartment or an off-the-plan apartment. And I give them, endless examples in Adelaide, because that's where I do most of my teaching, of apartment blocks that they would be very familiar with. There was some we've used in Glenelg, North Adelaide, Port Adelaide, in the CBD, where the majority of owners have had to sell for less than what they originally paid for them when they were brand new.
Yeah.
Generally, time heals all wounds in property, but you've got to wait a bloody long time to make up for the mistake if you bought a new apartment.
Oh, great. You probably remember the days, Peter. There was a time a few years back where developers were offering a free BMW if you bought an apartment down in Port Adelaide.
Right.
Remember that?
And they were selling the Newport Keys development. Yeah.
My God, the warning bells were going off my head. It's like nothing comes for free. You're paying for that. And if they're having to offer that to flog it, then there's a massive flashing red flag right there.
Very true.
Yeah, that's awesome. But what about some of the other mistakes that you see, mate?
People being sucked in by very clever marketeering.
Yeah.
By property spruikers. And that'll often happen when the property market is pumping, like it was, say, in Adelaide 2001, 2 and 3, or I've done a lot of teaching in Melbourne and Sydney, and I've seen when their property cycle was up near the peak, almost any day of the week there were 2 or 3 different seminars that you could go to who promised that you could get rich quick, or come to this boot camp for $5,000 and I'll teach you everything you need to know. So look, I've seen numerous mistakes, but probably the biggest ones is when they actually end up buying the wrong property.
Yeah. Yeah.
That look, and at the other end of the scale, it is very rare that you will find the perfect property, whatever perfect may mean. But what you want to be doing when you're looking for property is ticking as many of those boxes as you can. It's macro location, it's micro location, it's land component, it's looks, how many bedrooms does it have? Does this particular dwelling fit in with the rest of the suburb, or is this the only group of units in the whole suburb? And maybe you're making a mistake by buying the only group of units, because maybe people move into that suburb because they want houses rather than units.
Yeah, that's a good call. On the other side, I've seen a number of investors over the years who, and it's following on that comment around perfection, who are always going to but never quite get around to it. And I often talk about the importance of time. If you're going on a capital growth strategy, then time has a big impact. And I've had a couple of clients who, I keep talking to them every couple of years, and 10 years later they're still talking about it. And I've worked out how much that's cost them in capital growth. And if they'd bought a $400,000 property 10 years ago based on some fairly conservative growth figures, if I amortise it, it's cost them about between $3,000 and $4,000 a week in lost capital growth just by twiddling their thumbs. What's your experience of been around those that keep looking at it but never quite get off the starting line?
Yeah, look, there are certainly a number of people that I've met that suffer from analysis paralysis. They're forever crunching the numbers and not making a decision, but when they do make a decision, it's too late because somebody else has already bought it. Like I said to you before, excuse me, it is very rare you are going to find the perfect property. Make sure it fits as many criteria as possible, understanding that you are going to hold on to it for a long time. So, look, even if you paid, let's say it's a $500,000 property, and even if you paid an extra $5,000 for it, but you're going to hold it for 10 years, that is insignificant, because if we go in historical growth rates in Adelaide, let's say, or anywhere in Australia, that's going to more than double in 10 years' time.
Yeah.
So that $500,000 property is going to be worth 1.1, 1.2. I mean, so what that you paid an extra $5,000?
Yeah.
That's long term. We're talking long term.
Exactly.
I know when you're buying investment property, the dollars are crucial, but too many people are looking for a bargain. But you know what? Sometimes the bargain is exactly what they're asking, because the real estate agent or the owner haven't worked out that there is extra development potential there, so you can take advantage of it, or that the neighbour wants to sell as well. So if you could buy both properties, you could actually put on more dwellings proportionally than if you bought just one of them. So in the end, you're not going to make money in property unless you buy a property.
Yeah, that's right. Yes,
you have to make a decision.
What's that old saying by Confucius? If you want to be, do. I just think that...
I like that, Bushy. That's very good.
Sums that up pretty well.
Short and sweet.
Mate, something that sort of broadening the subject here a little bit, because I know you've co-authored a book on this subject of shares versus property. Because there's a lot of, again, and I've had a number of clients over the years who come to me and say, well, I've sort of been interested in shares, but I'm not convinced about the property thing. What's your view around that, mate, given you've done a lot of research and a lot of writing around that subject?
Yeah, so at TAFE, I've been running the property and share investment courses for over 15 years. And what I've found is property investors and share investors are two different animals. Very rarely will somebody have a similar amount of money invested in property and shares. Sure, there will be some people that own property, and that property, the value in their property portfolio might be hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yep. And
they'll also own shares, but their shares might only be worth hundreds or thousands, not hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yes.
So, I mean, if you were to read the book and you fast track to the last page, what it says is you need both.
Yes.
And I have both.
Yeah.
But I have far more invested in property than shares. But the good thing about shares is it gives you liquidity. In other words, you can sell some of the shares and have some cash pretty quickly. Unlike property, where it's very difficult to sell some of the house or some of the land, you have to sell it all. And unlike shares, you can't sell it, within a few minutes. It takes weeks or months to sell. So one of the great advantages that shares has is its liquidity. But for me, one of the great advantages that property has is its security. For those of you that do follow the share market, you've probably seen that it's fluctuated. Well, it's always fluctuated, but it is fluctuating a lot at the minute. And at the minute, it's because there are some trade tensions between China and the US. But there are many reasons why the share market will fluctuate. And unfortunately, if we look at the All Ordinaries Index as an indicator of the share market, it is still below what it was at just after at the worst of as a result of the GFC. So in 10 years, because the GFC was about 10 years ago, it still hasn't come up to that standard where you look at property, and even though Adelaide hasn't had a great time in the last 10 years, I think on average property in Adelaide's gone up 29%. In Brisbane, it's gone up 27% in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
In Hobart, it's gone up 50%. Poor old Perth, it's only gone up 5% in 10 years.
Yeah.
But in Sydney and Melbourne, it's almost doubled in that 10-year period. So for all capital cities in that 10-year period, property's gone up in value. It's just that in some of the cities, Sydney and Melbourne, it's gone up much higher than in some other cities like Perth. And the banks get it. Like if you went to the National Bank to borrow money to buy National Bank shares, your loan to value ratio, that is the amount of deposit you would have to put in, would be much higher than if you went to the National Bank to go and buy a house to live in. For a house to live in, you can get away with a 5% deposit plus some lender's mortgage insurance. With the shares, you'd be looking at a minimum of a 25 to 30% deposit. And if your share portfolio drops below a certain point, then you may get what they call a margin call, where the bank says, mate, you've got $30,000 worth of shares here. They've dropped to $25,000 in value. You need to put $5,000 in before the close of business tomorrow. Otherwise, where are you going to sell off your shares, some of your shares? So there is a lot of risk involved in shares. I do have some because of their liquidity. And look, most of my shares are mining shares. So the reason I bought that is, maybe 1 in a million, or maybe not that many, maybe 1 in 10, they will strike gold and they will go up in value markedly. But the reality is, especially with mining companies, most of them will not strike anything, and it's money down the drain. But that's the risk that you take.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point, and your closing comment in the book around it's not an or decision, it's an and exercise is really very relevant, because if I take my own case, Peter, when I first started into property, I was unfortunately divorced, had nothing. So I got into shares because I had a much lower capital to play with, but that enabled me to build the deposit from my first property. And because of the leverage side of property, I could then secure a much higher value asset, which even if it grows a little bit less than shares historically, I was going to be a lot better off. And then at the other end of the journey, so you've got to get into the cash flow, and then you convert, into capital growth, and then convert to cash flow at the other end. Then at the other end of my journey, which we're approaching, I've now gone back into equities, particularly index funds, where it's representing the whole market, not sort of trying to pick one racehorse in the overall race, but backing every horse in the event to give some diversification, but also to make sure that there's a decent cash flow at that end. So I just think you've raised some very good points around that, because you would hear it and I hear it all the time. Why shouldn't I invest in shares versus property and vice versa? Well, it's not an or decision. It's an and decision. It's just a matter of what to invest in when to achieve your long-term goals.
That's right. And more risk-averse investors are probably more likely to go towards property because it's more secure.
Yeah.
And those who are willing to take on a bigger risk will go towards shares.
Yeah, no, very good advice around that, mate. Now, just sort of revisiting, I want to sort of touch on the future, if I may, and I want to start there by revisiting that first book that you wrote around the top Australian suburbs. Given your active involvement in the industry, I'm no doubt that you continue to keep a close watch on that. Where do you think given that strategy and the approach that you're talking about, are there areas that you're identifying with your, rather than the rear view mirror, the telescope, that you think do have potential moving forward? What are your thoughts around that?
Look, I think if we're speaking very generally, it's undervalued suburbs close to the city or close to the sea.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I say that is, like 100 years ago, many of the manufacturing precincts of a major capital city were close to the city because that's where all transport hubs ended, and it was very important to be able to transport your goods on the train in particular. But with the coming on of freeways and highways, what we've seen is a lot of industrial precincts are now on the outskirts of our cities and being moved by semi-trailers and trucks. So, but what happens is that a lot of those areas that used to be full of factories and warehouses are now being regenerated through a process called gentrification.
Yeah.
So some of the suburbs that come to mind include, say, Paddington and Balmain in Sydney, Richmond and St Kilda in Melbourne, Norwood, Unley, Mile End in Adelaide, the West End in Brisbane. So these are areas where they weren't that popular for a number of reasons. It might have been because there was a lot of factories and warehouses, or it might have been full of crime, like I had a high crime rate because certain people used to live there. But over time, and generally because of its proximity to the city and the character or period style buildings in the area, they've become very, very popular with the people that work in the city. Generally, people that work in the city are what we call white-collar workers, and they tend to earn a higher than average income. Most people like to live relatively close to work, so they're the ones paying the fairly big dollars for the character or period-style homes close to the city or close to the sea.
Yeah.
So, and look, some of the suburbs that I picked 10 years ago, which I would continue to have a serious look at now, in Adelaide would be places like Thebarton. Thebarton's probably my number one suburb in Adelaide for people to look into.
Yep.
Thebarton and Torrensville are two of the inner western suburbs that I like. In Melbourne, Footscray and West Footscray. In Sydney, Tempe and St Peters. I know we don't have time to go through all of the capital cities
Sure.
and all of the suburbs, but
Yeah.
the key theme here is undervalued suburbs close to the city or the sea. Now, undervalued doesn't always mean cheaper, because sometimes there is a reason why a suburb is cheaper. But undervalued means if you can, let's say two suburbs side by side, and you pick similar style houses, and one style of house in a suburb is much cheaper than the other, but when you go for a drive or a walk through these suburbs, they look very similar.
Yeah.
Then that's what I call undervalued. So a good example in Adelaide is, say, Kensington. So Kensington is surrounded by the more expensive suburbs of Kensington Park, Beulah Park, Norwood, Kensington Gardens. But the little old suburb of Kensington is about $200,000 cheaper than those more expensive suburbs. And Kensington itself looks very similar to those other very expensive suburbs that I just mentioned.
Yeah.
So I think Kensington is very much an undervalued suburb.
Yeah.
And there are other suburbs around the other capital cities that would fit that same criteria. But it's not just looking at median price and working out what's undervalued based on median price. It's looking at, so we're comparing apples for apples and not Jonathan apples with Fuji apples. It's comparing Fuji apples with Fuji apples. So find the same style of property in two different suburbs and check and see if there's a significant difference in price. And if there is, go and have a look at the suburb to make sure that they are similar in character. Similar in character means similar housing style and similar streetscape.
Yeah. Very good summary there, mate, and some really good info for people to start digging into. Mate, sort of continuing the future focus, there's some sort of challenges potentially on the horizon for property investors, particularly with the federal Labor government talking about playing around with negative gearing and capital gains tax. What's your view on the impact that that's likely to have, and what do you think existing and potentially new investors should be doing about it, if anything?
Okay, so here we are at the end of 2018, and it is more than likely the Labor Party will get in the first half of 2019 in the federal election. And if they do get in, they're definitely going to be bringing in changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax. Now, there are many reasons that they want to bring it in. Probably number one reason is they can see that it's a great vote winner. But there are some realities that somebody within the Labor Party needs to work out before they implement this. Because the last time they fiddled with negative gearing capital gains tax was back in the 80s when Bob Hawke and Paul Keating did something, and then 6 months later they turned it around again because they could see that it created havoc in the property and more so the building industry.
Yeah.
So some of the realities are, Bushy.
Yeah.
They say, it'll be better for the budget bottom line if we don't give investors as many tax benefits for negatively geared property. Well, when it comes to providing negative gearing benefits to property investors, they amount to the billions of dollars, which is a lot of money.
Yeah.
But what they don't tell you is, or maybe nobody's worked this out yet in the Labor Party, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
The current government actually earns tens of billions of dollars in capital gains tax revenue.
Yeah.
So the only way you're going to get capital gains tax revenue is if people are buying investments such as property or shares, which grow in value, and then they pay tax on a portion of that, or maybe the whole lot, depending on how they've structured it.
Yeah.
So if you discourage people from buying property, then you are going to have less capital gains tax revenue. So at the moment, so far as investors are concerned and the budget bottom line is concerned, the government is better off in keeping the status quo because they earn more once the investor sells the property as compared to the money that they give in the first few years in negative gearing benefits.
Yeah.
And from a government perspective, the other benefit that the investor is providing is obviously housing.
Exactly.
Now, if the Labor Party want to bring in these changes, then at the same time, well, they need to increase their affordable and social housing initiatives, because if less people are going to buy investment property, where are the renters going to live?
Yeah.
Again, somebody hasn't done that simple maths.
Yeah.
And if there are less rental properties and the same number of renters, well, rents are going to go up, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's simple demand and supply.
Exactly right. It's, I guess the frustration for me, Peter, and I've been reasonably vocal about this subject in the media in recent months, and in fact, Chris Bowen actually had a crack at me and called me a rich investor who's just trying to protect my own backyard. But the biggest fear for me is that it's a bit of the tail wagging the dog, and I don't make comments based on gut feel. There's been a good 8 independent studies done by very well-respected research houses that are all coming to the same conclusion, that instigating these changes will have effects across the board. Some of the projections I've seen are potentially, wiping nearly $600 billion off the value of everyone's home across the country. Rising rents, as a consequence of the fact of what you've just said, is that we've already got a housing shortage. Governments aren't building houses anymore, and the way of overcoming it in the past was incentivise mum and dads to invest in property to increase the stock. So if we've got a shrinkage in supply, less houses to live in, then guess what? Rents are going to go up. So I'm not seeing anyone win in this, and I can't see how it's contributing to the housing affordability debate that has dominated discussions over the last 12 months. What's your feeling around that?
Yeah, look, Bushy, if we lived in a command economy like there is in North Korea and the government supplied all the housing, then we wouldn't need property investors.
Yeah.
But when you live in a market economy and the private individual is able to buy investment property, then one of the benefits is that they provide housing for those who either can't afford to buy or they don't want to buy.
Yeah.
But you and I, as we've said before, we're a similar era.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, Bushy, but I've seen many young people now aren't as keen to buy property as when I was their age, when I was, say, 20s. Yeah. When I ask my uni students about they are property students, when I ask them about their personal situation, they're more interested in living where they want to live. Now, whether they rent there or buy there is not as important as living where they want to live. And for most people, it's near the CBD.
Yeah.
All right? So, supplying more housing out on the urban fringe does nothing for housing affordability closer to the city.
Yeah.
Because, like I said before, location is very important to property, right? Because you can't change that. So building lots of houses out on the city fringe will help keep the prices down of those houses out on the city fringe.
Yeah.
But it doesn't do anything for other areas.
Yeah.
So I sincerely hope, I don't just want to can these proposed changes. What I really want is for the Labor Party or the decision makers in the Labor Party, so far as these policies are concerned, to sit down at a table with the stakeholders, for example, the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, the Property Investors Council of Australia, maybe the Housing Industry Association, the MBA, other stakeholders, so we can work out what are you trying to achieve, and maybe there are some alternative solutions to achieving that. Because as you mentioned, there is no doubt that when this is brought in, property prices are going to come down.
Yep.
Now, at the moment, I think, according to CoreLogic, all the residential property in Australia is worth $7 trillion.
Yeah.
Now, that's a lot of zero. Even if you bring down that by 5%, that is billions of dollars in lost value from everybody's home. Because when the prices come down, it's not just investors' homes that come down in value. It's those people who already own their home, those people who are trying to pay off their home, as well as investors. Everybody's house value will drop. Yeah. So please, rather than using this blunt sledgehammer to try and solve whatever issues you think there are out there, let's all sit down and try and be more surgical and come up with more specific solutions to these issues.
Yeah, brilliant advice. And it's getting themselves fully informed that is often the start of getting a good solution to anything, and encouraging them to really get out and about and not rely on a 2-year-old Treasury study that was done at the height of the Sydney property rise, but look at a more holistic exercise with all the inputs is brilliant advice, mate. And involving PIPA, which is the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, which you're the great chairman of. And you mentioned PICA as well. And for those listeners who aren't aware of PICA yet, that's the Property Investment Council of Australia. It's a membership group by investors for investors. It's a group that is really wanting to educate each other on the benefits and how to invest, but also become an advocate group for those to have a representative voice in the discussions around it, because there's over 2.2 million property investors in Australia. It's a big portion of our population. And for those that haven't done, membership's $5. So jump on picker.asn, I think it is. Spend your $5, become a member. And I think PICA's running a petition at the moment around concerns about this negative gearing and capital gains tax issue. So jump on board with that. But mate, just sort of rounding that discussion off, the old planning for the worst and expecting the best exercise, what do you think investors should be, both existing investors and potentially new investors, should be doing, given that may come into play?
So, I mean, at the moment we also have an issue with the banks being so tight on lending. So a lot of people are finding that, they've come out of the interest-only loan and they have to go to principal and interest, which has a significant impact on their cash flow. So really what you need, probably number one, is a war chest. In other words, you need some cash for if you do need to go to principal and interest, you can cover that extra repayment for a period of time, or if something untoward does happen as a result of the change in the negative gearing and capital gains tax policies, that you don't have to sell your property straight away. You do have the equivalent of 1 or 2 years' worth of rent to help tide you over, because I'm an optimistic sort of person, so I see the glass half full. Yeah. What I'm seeing now is, and I've been in property a long time, if I can put this picture in the listener's head. So what you've got at the moment is people knocking on banks' doors, and the banks are not opening their doors. But in the meantime, more and more people are knocking at the banks' doors. Now, over time, the pendulum will swing, and the lending will not be as tight, which means the banks will open their doors. And when the banks open their doors, there will be plenty of people chomping at the bit to borrow money and buy property. Yeah. So if we look at the positive side, at the minute, I think it's a great buying opportunity.
Yes.
There's not many people in the market. Unfortunately, property prices are coming down. I've done 2 radio interviews in the last in the last day, based on what's happening in Sydney, where Sydney property prices have dropped almost 10%, and that's mainly been because they reached their peak in the property cycle, so they're on the way down. But what's accentuated that is foreigners are discouraged from buying property, and most foreigners targeted Sydney and Melbourne. Yeah. And more recently is there are less people going to auctions and open inspections who can bid at auctions, who can put in offers, because they just cannot borrow the money.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, property prices will continue to drop while this is happening, but it provides a great opportunity. What the Labor Party have said the last time I checked on their website is there is no predetermined date when they hope to bring in these changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax. So it's not like, they'll get voted in and then the next day they're going to be implemented.
Yeah.
So keep your eye on that, but in the meantime, save your money, put it aside in an offset account, in some bank account, something. Have that cash ready, because you don't want to be put in a position where you have to sell your property when other people also have to sell a property, because you won't be getting a very good price.
Absolutely. I made a really good number of points there, and one of them that I just want to reinforce with you is the fact that if you're investing for 10 or 15 years, you don't make a decision at year 4 or 5. And if just because the media might be claiming the sky's about to fall in because that sells newspapers, doesn't mean that it's a disaster. And because we tend to take a very short-term view now, Peter, because of instant everything on the iPhone, we tend to forget that the property does move in cycles. And I've quoted you a number of times in recent discussions where, everyone's talking about the rapid rise that occurred in Sydney and now the fall. Well, if you go back over the last 15 years or so, Sydney's actually been the worst performing market in the country from a capital growth perspective.
And if you go back beyond that, that was because they had such a great growth leading up to the Olympic Games.
Yes. So I guess the exercise there for me is I expect there to be corrections in all markets at periods of time, and 10% doesn't scare me one little bit. I was just waiting for that to occur. So it's not like it's going to plummet and have the sort of falls that the share market does. This is a normal correction, and then it'll be flat for quite some years. The sort of S-curve move of the property market is what we've seen right back since Federation. It's moved this way. So don't be scared by what you're seeing in the headlines. I think 5 out of the 8 capital cities in the last 12 months have actually seen property growth, not falls. It just happens to be that Sydney and now Melbourne are going through their normal correction phase. So for me, and great advice, war chest some funds, rainy day reserves so that you can see the ups and downs, stay the course, make it affordable, stop listening to the news, and focus on the long term, I think, is the real exercise as far as that goes for me. And I just flowing on from there, one thing I see in these sorts of times, Peter, and you've been in the game a long time as well, I start to see investors get sucked in by potential scammers, and I was really pleased to see that ASIC's finally had a crack at Rick Otten, who's been flogging these rent-to-buy schemes for many years now, and I think they've fined him $15 million or something as a result.
Yeah, $18 million.
18, is it?
18. I mean, that is huge. Just imagine how much he ripped people off to get fined that.
Exactly. So I get interested in your comments, but don't start chasing get-rich-quick schemes just because there's some fears around what's happening in the normal property market. What are your thoughts around that, mate?
Yeah, look, property is a get-rich-slow scheme.
Yeah, wealth by stealth is what I'd often say. Yeah, exactly right.
But you can make quicker money by developing, but that's a lot riskier. But in the main, most of the successful property investors, whether they be residential or commercial, have bought and held and ridden the wave of capital growth.
Yeah, that's an awesome piece of advice right there. Excellent. Now, something that I do think is interesting, though, and it's something that I've only really picked up in researching our discussion today, Peter, is the concept of POPI. Do you want to elaborate on what that is, how that works, and where the opportunity may be in that area?
Yep. So POPI stands for Property Options for Pensioners and Investors. So it's really an opportunity for a property investor to have the option to buy a pensioner's house. So just to give you the example that I have, so I have, a few years ago, I signed up for an option to buy a house that a couple of pensioners currently live in Unley Park. Now, it's a bungalow in Unley Park, so it's a quite expensive property. Probably wouldn't have made sense to buy it as a straight-out investment property because the negative cash flow may have been a killer. So I have the option to buy that property. So not the obligation, but the option. So what happens is I give these pensioners a monthly payment, and that doesn't affect their pension, which is great. So basically I've just increased their income by 50%.
Yeah.
So they love it. But I also love it because I don't really have tenants. If there's anything that goes wrong with the house, that's not my issue because I don't actually own the home.
Yep.
I have the option to buy the home in the future. So the idea is that in 10 years' time, or I hope they live for, till 100, which means in 30 years' time, I have the option to buy that house, but whatever the price was a few years ago when we signed up. So I get to benefit from all that capital growth, but I don't have the typical hassles that an investor has.
Yep.
The land tax, the stamp duty to buy the place in the first place, the repairs and maintenance costs, and I didn't have to borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars. I just need a decent cash flow so I can make these monthly payments. Now, I can stop these monthly payments whenever I want, but if I do, then I lose my option to buy it. Now, if in 5 years' time we've discovered that, property prices haven't gone up in Unley Park, and if I did buy it, I'd be making a loss, well, I would just say I'm not interested in exercising my option.
Yeah.
So the risk for me is all that money that I've spent for all those years giving monthly payments has gone down the drain.
Yeah.
But if I can't make money on a character house in Unley Park, then I know nothing about property.
Yeah, now just for listeners interstate, Unley Park is a southern fringe suburb, very high demand, very tightly held, great character homes, all the positive things that you were talking about earlier in terms of investment potential.
Probably the Sydney equivalent is Mossman, the Melbourne equivalent is Toorak.
Yeah.
Now, the fellas that started up Poppy, one of them is one of my lecturers in property law.
Yeah.
They are just relaunching it. But I'm sure if you were to Google Poppy or property options for pensioners and investors, you would find an email address. But if you couldn't, I'm more than happy for people to email me and I can pass on those contact details. One of the issues that they found was it was very hard to match investors with pensioners. So what they're doing is looking to go much bigger scale now. I can't let the cat out of the bag, but what I can do is let people know that you can get information about Poppy. You will have to do a Google search, or in the worst case scenario, email me and I can give you the details of the two fellas that started it up.
Yeah, I just think it's that's creative thinking that is still ethical, because
I like it on a number of different levels.
Yeah.
One is that I'm helping people out who obviously need help, because I know the last time you looked at how much pensioners earn, but it's not a lot.
34 grand for a couple and 24 for a single, mate. If you can get the whole lot, that's bugger all.
Very good. So, I mean, that's obviously not the main reason I did it. The main reason I did it is so that we could increase our retirement income when our time comes.
Yeah.
But that is a benefit. The other benefits, like I said, I didn't have to go to the bank to borrow money. But the negative side of that is I can't say to the bank, oh, look, I've got this option to buy this house.
Yeah.
Because to the bank, that means nothing.
Yeah.
So there are, pluses and minuses, but to have at least one of these poppies in my property portfolio, I think is great diversification.
Yeah, I think it's solving a problem, but also creating an opportunity. So I know myself, my good mother, before she passed, she was asset rich but income poor. And we, as a family, we ended up subsidising that to maintain her lifestyle. Now, if you've got the opportunity here for someone who doesn't want to leave the home, this is where all their friends, their family, their community, their church, their bowling group, you name it's all there. They don't want to lose that. But they suddenly got a income stream that's allowing them to enjoy their golden years. And at the same time, you're locking in a purchase cost, and your reward for that is the capital growth over time. It's a win-win for both. I guess how do you cover off, because I can see a lot of families feeling uncomfortable that mum or dad is potentially giving away their legacy. How does that cover off, mate?
Well, I did this a few years ago, but I'm pretty sure the family had to sign a piece of paper that made them all aware of what mum and dad were doing.
Yeah. Great.
So family is fully aware of what's happening, which I like as well. So then there's no hassles, no nasty surprises when the family thinks they're going to, collect all this money when the property is sold.
Yeah.
But the reality is I need to collect my money first, and then you can have the rest.
Awesome, mate. Look, very, very creative. I think we're taking away from that is there's still, as long as people are living in property, there's an opportunity to invest in property is always been my view, and I share your optimism in that regard. Mate, I just want to switch now into what I call the ambush round, which is just 5 questions that our listeners always like to get people's opinions on. And I'll start with, what's your favourite quote and why?
If it was easy, everyone would be doing it.
Yeah, love that.
Because I see far too many people give up. They think, they might come and do my course and then they expect to find the investment of a lifetime in the next week or two. But the reality is that you might be lucky and find one very quickly, but the reality is you're going to be searching for a long time. You're going to go to many open inspections, a few auctions. You're going to put in a few offers and miss out. But there will come the time when you will buy the right property for you. And remember, it's not grocery shopping where you got to do it every week or every fortnight and you're looking to buy, and you can afford to buy hundreds of them. For most people, you're only going to buy 1 or 2. So just be prepared to put in the time and the effort, and providing you've got some education behind you, you will be rewarded by buying the right property in the right location.
Yeah, good commentary. Mate, moving on to that education aspect, what's the top book that you'd recommend and why?
Making Money Made Simple by Noel Whittaker.
Yeah.
I read that as a relatively young lad, and that made money management and investing, that explained it very well for me in nice and easy, everyday, simple terms. So I would highly recommend people get a copy of that. He's also written many other books, but that's probably the best one that I have read.
Yeah, he's written a number of really good ones, and it's Australian, so it's very relevant. It's very easy to read. There's usable tips there that you can put into play straight away. He's been a great advocate for property for many years, so awesome tip there. Sort of talking around the tax aspect, because a lot of Australians feel that they pay too much tax. What's the top thing that you've done to minimise the tax you pay, mate?
Putting property in different entities, like in family trusts, maybe put it into the lowest income earner's name, holding on to new property because it's got great depreciation benefits. Look, I don't have a problem with paying tax. I think everybody should pay tax because otherwise our teachers and policemen and so on wouldn't get paid.
Yeah.
But you need to minimise your tax and just pay what you ought to pay rather than, not be fully aware of all the rules and regulations and maybe end up paying more than you should be paying.
Yeah, no, great tip. Now, talking about the investment piece, what's both the worst and the best piece of investment advice that you've ever received, Peter?
The best and worst investment advice. Probably the worst investment advice was to buy a property in a holiday location, like one of those service departments. Not that I ever did, thank God.
Yep.
And the best investment advice, and this was from my dad, was to buy property. It's very simple. The mistake that I did make was I should have started buying earlier, because as a young lad, as many young people, don't listen to your parents. I didn't start investing until my late 20s, but if I had started investing earlier, I would be better off than what I am today. But it's never too late. I just got to wait for one extra property cycle, which in Adelaide is not too far away.
Exactly right. Yeah, I'm pretty bullish about where Adelaide and Brisbane in particular are heading in the short to medium term. Mate, what's a personal habit that contributes to your investment success?
Diligence.
Yeah.
So, checking on the net for properties, catching up with real estate agents, catching up with other property professionals to find out what's actually happening in the real world of property. So it's the fact that I'm diligent, I reckon.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You do your homework, fully informed before you jump in. but don't procrastinate and wait forever and miss the boat. So, awesome advice there, mate. Sort of bringing things to a close, and I really appreciate you sharing so generously today, Peter. But what's next new and exciting for you, mate?
Investment-wise?
Yeah, or generally.
Well, I'm about to start my summer holiday, so I'm really happy about that. Investment-wise, so we're finishing off the 3 places on the Esplanade of Port Noarlunga South. We're going to settle on that house in Brooklyn Park with my daughter, but I am looking for another project to do. And like I said to you before, I think it's a great buying opportunity because there's less people around looking.
Yep.
I just need to make sure that I buy the right one and make sure that I'm not in a rush to sell, because I actually think things will get a little bit worse before they get better, because we've got the Banking Royal Commission findings will come out in February next year, and I'm sure that there'll be some more direction that banks will need to take to meet those requirements. But then things will loosen again, as they've done in the past. Right at the minute, we're at one extreme, and I've never seen lending so tight. It's even tighter than it was straight after the GFC.
Yep.
But I've also seen it at the other extreme where people could borrow 107% of the value of the property. Yep. So, finishing a development project, about to buy something with one of my kids, but also looking for another project.
Yeah, I like you, I'm a bit of a contrarian, Peter, and having seen the market cycles over many decades, I'm really bullish about the opportunities now, because if you're in a position where you can do something, there's going to be some great opportunities over the next couple of years. So, no, that's awesome, mate. Mate, for those that are interested in getting in touch with you, but particularly given the education piece that people can take advantage of to really inform themselves so they know what they're getting into, what's the best way for them to do that, mate?
So if they go to the TAFE SA website, tafesa.edu.au, and they, in the search field, they put in property, they should see the 3 courses: Fundamentals of Property Investment, Renovating for Investment, and Property Development Workshop. We run weeknight and weekend courses, so those people that don't live in Adelaide can come along and do the courses on a weekend. And just the last course that we finished 2 weeks ago, we had about 20% of our students came from Victoria. In the past, we've had people from country South Australia, have had somebody from Queensland. And a lot of ours seem to come from Victoria, I suppose, because Melbourne is the closest capital city to Adelaide.
Yeah.
But I would strongly encourage you to check out the courses on the TAFE SA website. If you want a more formal education, UniSA offers a Bachelor of Business in Property. But if you already have a degree and want to know more about property, there is also the Masters of Property that is offered at the University of Adelaide.
Brilliant, mate. Look, fantastic, Peter. That's been a really awesome discussion. I think the listeners have got a lot of gold that they can take home from today. Would love to keep talking to you progressively because the market's always changing. There's always interesting things happening in property. So if you're open to it, Peter, would love to get you back on board on a regular basis just to share your knowledge and foresight in that regard.
Happy to do so, Bushy. Happy to help out.
Thanks, Peter. Well, you enjoy a well-earned break, and we'll stay in touch, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, mate.
Well, freedom fighters, how good was that? To get a summary of all this investment gold in the show notes, just email me on hello@khgroup.com.au. That's hello@khgroup.com.au. Or check us out at www.bushymartin.com.au/get invested. I look forward to joining you next week for another episode of the Get Invested podcast. So thanks for listening, and as always, dream as if you live forever and live as if you'll die